I never imagined that Christmas Eve at Fort Drum would be the night I would feel completely abandoned by the people who were supposed to protect me. The cold hit my skin like 1,000 needles as I lay sprawled in the snow beneath the second-floor barracks window. My body was numb from the freezing 14 degrees Fahrenheit, my uniform soaked with ice and frost, and I could feel the sharp sting of my spine from the impact. My stepdad had just slammed me through that window. I remember the shock of the glass against my back and the sudden rush of air as I fell, the ground approaching faster than I could comprehend. For a moment, I could not even tell if I was breathing or if my body would respond at all. The sounds of Christmas lights flickering in the barracks behind me were distant and surreal, and inside, people were laughing, clinking silverware, eating their dinner completely unaware that I was lying here broken, exposed, and fighting for my life. I tried to focus on the pain to catalog it to make sense of what had just happened, but my mind kept replaying the moment I saw his eyes as he shoved me. There was no hesitation, no remorse, only that cold, controlled expression I had learned to fear over years of living under his shadow. My stepbrother stood nearby at the top of the stairs, smirking as if it were all a joke. I could barely move, but I could see him leaning against the wall, unconcerned, watching me with the same detached amusement my stepdad had always encouraged in him. The cold made every breath a struggle, and each second felt like an eternity. My thoughts raced to my training. I remembered the survival drills, the hypothermia protocols, the instructions they drilled into us during winter exercises. I told myself to stay awake, to keep my blood circulating, to move my fingers and toes just enough to avoid total numbness. My fingers were ice blocks and my legs refused to respond. Every attempt to roll over made a new wave of pain shoot through my back. I screamed internally at the injustice of it all, at the betrayal of the two people who should have cared. I remembered every Christmas Eve growing up under their watchful eyes, every manipulation, every small control, and now this was the culmination. They had made me feel invisible all my life, but never this way, never so physically helpless, so publicly exposed, lying on the frozen ground while the world went on without noticing. I wanted to call out for help, for someone, anyone, to recognize me, but the barracks were full of soldiers laughing at their meal, and my voice would not reach them. My ears burned from the cold, and my teeth chattered violently. I realized then that I was utterly alone except for the bitter wind that howled across the snowy yard. And yet, amid the pain and the fear, a tiny spark ignited in me. I remembered the countless drills I had endured, the resilience I had built through years of military training, and I refused to let this moment define me. Every breath I took was a deliberate act of defiance. I knew survival would not just be about physical endurance, but mental fortitude. I focused on each movement, slow, deliberate pushes of my fingers, curling my toes, trying to flex muscles that seemed frozen solid. I visualized the warmth of the ambulance lights, the sound of the EMT calling my name, the feel of being safe and alive. That vision kept me going even as the cold began to pierce through my bones. For an hour, I lay there completely at the mercy of my stepdad's cruelty, the freezing temperature and the indifference of the people inside the barracks. It was the longest 60 minutes of my life, each tick of the clock a reminder of my vulnerability and of how easily one could be broken by the very people who claimed to love you. But I survived. I clenched my jaw, refused to give in to the cold, and focused on each micro-movement, as if each one was a victory against the betrayal surrounding me. I told myself that this would not be the end, that someday justice would be served, that my strength and intelligence would outlast their cruelty. And if you have ever witnessed the people you trusted fail you, if you have ever felt abandoned when you needed someone the most, then you know exactly how I felt in that snow, lying under the second-floor barracks window. Every flake of snow felt like a frozen judgment, a reminder that courage is forged in the most desperate of circumstances. So I held on to life with every ounce of energy I had left, refusing to fade into the silence, refusing to let their betrayal define my story. If you have ever faced this kind of betrayal, comment below. I want to hear your story. I had always known Fort Drum in New York could be unforgiving, especially in December when the temperatures dropped well below zero, but nothing could have prepared me for the cold that Christmas Eve. The barracks loomed over the snow-covered courtyard, 2 stories of gray brick and narrow windows that seemed to trap the icy wind against the walls. I had spent years in the military learning discipline logistics and survival, but tonight the familiar surroundings felt sinister. My stepdad, Lieutenant Colonel Robert Keating, had served as an officer in the base for over a decade. He managed the barracks with strict rules, ensuring every soldier followed protocol. Yet behind that rigid professionalism lay a suffocating control that had followed me from my childhood. My mother had passed when I was 12, leaving me under the care of him and my stepmother Janet, whose smile rarely reached her eyes. From a young age, both had dictated every part of my life: what I wore, who I spoke to, even the activities I could pursue. I had joined the Army partly to escape that grasp to prove I could be independent, but even here their shadow loomed. That evening, after finishing a logistics assignment in the motor pool, I returned to my room in the barracks with a throbbing hand from a recent minor injury. The corridors were quiet, only the faint hum of the heating system cutting through the chill. The room I had shared during training was sparsely furnished: 2 narrow cots, a desk cluttered with papers, and a small dresser. The second-story window faced the central courtyard where snow had already begun to drift in gentle layers. Normally, it offered a quiet view of the base's perimeter lights and the evergreen trees dusted with white, but tonight it became a silent witness to a cruelty I never imagined. The base followed strict winter protocols, yet no amount of procedure could protect me from family betrayal. My stepdad's stepson Michael had joined the Army a few years after me, and the rivalry that had started at home continued here. While I focused on my logistics duties, Michael seemed intent on monitoring my every move, reporting back any perceived misstep. Robert's approval of Michael's behavior had been consistent throughout my life. He encouraged obedience and subtly punished resistance. The tension between them and me was palpable. Their presence in the barracks corridors always felt like a reminder that control had not been relinquished even in uniform, even on a military base. The rooms smelled faintly of disinfectant and old wood polish, the windows frosted along the edges. I could hear distant laughter and chatter from the mess hall soldiers celebrating the holiday season, oblivious to the storm brewing in the barracks. As I unpacked my bag, my hand throbbed painfully, a reminder that no matter how strong or trained I was still human, still vulnerable to those who had wielded authority over me my entire life. That cold, sterile environment, combined with the personal history with my stepdad and stepbrother, set the stage for what was about to unfold. The barracks, which should have been a place of rest and security, had become a stage for cruelty, with every detail: the icy wind whistling through narrow hallways, the hard wooden floors, the second-story windows, and the distant hum of base life, heightening my awareness that the confrontation was inevitable. The historical pattern of control from my stepdad and stepmother, the training and independence I had fought for, and the rigid military environment created a tension that was almost tangible, like the frost creeping along the window panes. Even the simplest of interactions, walking down the hallway to the bathroom passing by my stepbrother's room, carried the weight of years of psychological conditioning. My back stiffened at the thought of encountering them that evening during the routine barracks check. Each element of military life, the strict chain of command, assigned quarters, winter protocols, intertwined with the toxic family dynamics to create a situation that was as dangerous emotionally as it was physically. The barracks, the snow, the second-floor window, and the base's structure itself all became silent accomplices to the family tension that had been building for decades. I felt the chill, not just on my skin, but deep in my chest, a mixture of cold and foreboding that told me something catastrophic was about to happen. This was the military life I had chosen, yet the very environment that should have given me safety now held the shadows of my stepdad's lifelong control, setting the stage for a moment that would test not just my body, but every ounce of courage, resilience, and intelligence I had acquired as a soldier. I remember waking up every morning as a child feeling like I was living in a cage, one without bars but with rules so strict that freedom was impossible. My mother had passed when I was 12, leaving me in the hands of my stepdad Robert and my stepmother Janet. At first, I thought having a father figure in my life might provide guidance and protection, but quickly I realized that Robert was not a protector in the way I had hoped. He controlled everything: what I wore, what I ate, who I could be friends with, even how I spent my free time. Janet, though quieter, enforced his rules and reported back any small missteps as though she were a surveillance agent rather than a parent. Each day, the subtle criticisms and comparisons became lessons in obedience, teaching me that questioning authority was not only frowned upon, but punished. My stepdad would constantly compare me to Michael, his son, highlighting every tiny mistake I made, praising Michael for things that should have been normal for a child my age. I learned early on that pleasing Robert meant enduring scrutiny and defiance, even in small doses, led to anger, cold stares, or deprivation of privileges. Every meal, every school project, every interaction felt like a test. I grew up conditioned to anticipate judgment, to second-guess my choices, to measure my words carefully, and to hide my feelings. It was a life of constant psychological tension that left me hyper-aware of every action, teaching me survival strategies long before I understood what survival meant outside the home. When I turned 15, I began to notice that this control was not just about discipline. It was about power and dominance. Robert took subtle pleasure in demonstrating that I could never be independent, that my body, mind, and emotions were not fully my own. Even as I excelled in school and sports, he found ways to diminish my achievements, to remind me that I was still under his authority. By the time I reached 17, I knew that leaving home would be my only chance at freedom. The pattern of abuse was so ingrained that I often questioned my own judgment, wondering if I was overreacting or imagining threats that were simply the standard of a strict household. But deep down, I felt trapped, suffocated by the invisible chains that had been wrapped around me since childhood. On my 18th birthday, I made the decision to enlist in the Army. I applied to Fort Drum, New York, knowing the rigorous training and discipline would be a world apart from my home life. I longed for a place where rules existed for everyone equally, where merit and effort could shape my path rather than arbitrary control and favoritism. Joining the military was not just a career choice. It was my act of defiance, my declaration that I would reclaim autonomy over my life. Yet even as I arrived at boot camp, I carried the psychological weight of years of manipulation. The conditioning, the constant anticipation of judgment, followed me into every drill, every exercise, every evaluation. I realized that this training in vigilance, attention to detail, and discipline, though grueling, was the tool I needed to protect myself in the real world. My early experiences had instilled in me both a fear of authority and a keen ability to read intentions, to detect subtle cues of danger or manipulation. These skills would later become crucial when facing my stepdad and stepbrother on base. Even within the military structure, where hierarchy and obedience were expected, I could sense the ways in which my personal history intertwined with professional life. The lessons I had learned about control, punishment, and observation from childhood became a silent guide as I navigated life on base. I knew how to anticipate aggression, how to manage fear, and how to protect my mind, even when my body might be vulnerable. Despite all of this, nothing could have prepared me for the depth of betrayal that awaited me the moment when the person who had dominated my childhood would seek to assert that same dominance in the very place I had come to claim freedom. The pattern of abuse, the years of psychological conditioning, and the longing for independence were all converging into a situation where my survival would not just depend on my physical strength or military training, but on every lesson I had learned about resilience, perception, and courage since childhood. Every fear, every moment of doubt, every strategy for self-preservation would be tested that night, reminding me that escaping control once does not guarantee safety forever, and that the shadows of family betrayal can reach into even the most disciplined and structured environments. Christmas Eve at Fort Drum was supposed to be a quiet night, a momentary pause in the relentless cold of New York winter. The barracks were dimly lit, decorated with a few makeshift wreaths and strings of white lights that flickered faintly against the cinder block walls. Soldiers gathered in small groups, some laughing quietly, others checking their phones, the scent of reheated meals and instant coffee lingering in the air. I moved slowly through the mess hall, carrying my tray, aware of the frost clinging to my boots from the brief walk outside. My arms still throbbed from a minor injury sustained during training, a reminder of the physical toll my military duties had taken over the past few months. I kept my head down, hoping to remain invisible to simply eat and retreat back to my room. But I could feel the eyes of Robert, my stepdad, piercing across the room. He sat at a long table near the corner, his posture rigid, a faint smirk playing on his lips as he watched my every movement. Beside him, Michael, my stepbrother, lounged lazily, pretending disinterest, but glancing up to mimic the expressions of mockery his father wore. I had learned early in life that nothing escaped their scrutiny. Every gesture, every misstep was cataloged and judged. Tonight, even in this neutral setting of the barracks mess hall, the tension between us hung like a heavy fog. As I reached for a chair, Michael leaned back just enough to nudge it with his elbow. The chair wobbled dangerously, and I had to steady myself, my tray clattering slightly as I caught it. A few soldiers glanced my way, but they quickly returned to their own conversations, oblivious to the dynamics playing out at the corner table. I could feel Robert's jaw tighten, his eyes narrowing. The smallest mistake, the slightest misalignment of behavior, was enough to ignite his anger. Michael's smirk widened as he whispered something under his breath, too quiet for anyone else to hear, but loud enough to make my stomach knot. I recognized the familiar combination of mischief and malice. It was the same pattern from my childhood, the orchestrated taunt to provoke a reaction. My pulse quickened, but I forced myself to remain calm, keeping my hands steady and my voice neutral as I murmured a polite apology for the chair wobble. It was no use. Robert's glare intensified, and I could feel the tension in the room shift slightly, even if no one else noticed. Each bite of my food became a calculated effort to avoid drawing attention, to move slowly, silently invisible within the chaos of the barracks dinner. Michael, however, was relentless. He continued subtle provocations, dropping utensils near my tray, knocking lightly on the table in rhythm with my movements, whispering comments just beyond comprehension. I tried to ignore him, focusing on my breathing, on maintaining composure. But the combination of his taunts and Robert's ever-watchful presence created a pressure that was suffocating. And then it happened, a small accident, seemingly insignificant, yet perfectly timed. My tray shifted as I reached for a cup of coffee, spilling a few drops onto the floor. It was a minor mistake, a drop that any soldier might have shrugged off, but I knew Robert's reaction before it even came. His face, hardened lips pressed together in a tight line, eyes flashing with the same controlled anger that had dictated my childhood. Michael looked at me, his grin malicious, enjoying the tension he had helped escalate. The room seemed to narrow around me, the warmth of the barracks dimming as I felt the full weight of anticipation, the sense that something catastrophic was about to unfold. Every muscle in my body tensed as Robert rose slowly, the chair scraping against the tile floor. Soldiers around us barely noticed the subtle shift, but I felt it in every nerve ending, the air thick with the looming presence of intent. The combination of minor mistakes, deliberate provocation, and years of psychological conditioning had created the perfect storm. I knew, even in that fleeting moment, that Robert's response would be extreme. The build-up, the relentless tension, and the careful orchestration by both stepdad and stepbrother had led to a single point where control and chaos collided, and I realized I was at the center of it. This was no longer a matter of discipline or family tension. It was a culmination of patterns, a carefully choreographed act of power, and the trigger that would send my world into a sudden, unthinkable spiral. I braced myself, heart pounding, fully aware that everything I had trained for my survival skills, my mental toughness, my vigilance was about to be tested in a moment that would change my life forever. I never had a moment to react before Robert's hand gripped my upper arm and propelled me backward. The force sent me flying through the cold air, the barracks wall rushing past as the window frame gave way. Glass shards caught the dim light for a brief, terrifying instant, though mercifully none cut my skin. The snow outside met me with a biting force, the cold searing through the layers of my uniform and into my body. I hit the ground hard ribs, absorbing much of the impact, my back twisting painfully as I tried to roll instinctively to lessen the fall. The shock of the cold air hit immediately, sharp and unrelenting. My breath left me in a cloud of vapor as I struggled to draw it back, chest aching from the collision. Every part of me screamed in alarm, muscles stiffening, joints protesting the unnatural angle of the fall. For a moment, I lay still frozen in more than just temperature, my mind racing to assess the damage. The world was muffled almost unreal as snowflakes settled on my hair and uniform. I could feel the sting of hypothermia beginning to creep into my extremities, numbness spreading from fingers and toes, yet adrenaline surged through me, keeping me marginally aware and painfully conscious. My back throbbed with a deep, persistent ache, and I could feel that something in my spine had shifted unnaturally, a reminder that my military training in logistics and basic survival would be tested to the extreme. I tried to move my limbs cautiously, testing for fractures, bruises, anything that would render me immobile. My arms were stiff, but functioning enough to push myself slightly upward. My mind cataloged each sensation: pain in the lower back, a jolt in the shoulder, a tightness in the legs. Time became fluid, the minutes stretching as I realized I was utterly exposed. The barracks loomed above the faint lights behind the window, mocking me, the figures of my stepdad and stepbrother still visible for an instant before they retreated back inside. Indifference radiated from them, a chilling confirmation that I was utterly alone in that frozen expanse. I forced myself to breathe deeply, using techniques drilled into me for stress management and survival under duress. Each inhale brought icy air that burned the lungs, yet I clung to it as a tether to consciousness. Hypothermia was setting in rapidly, my fingers now tingling and pale lips numb and muscles beginning to lose coordination. The cold was relentless, a physical enemy pressing in from every direction. I knew the first hour would determine whether I could survive at all. Using the small energy I had, I curled slightly into a fetal position to preserve warmth, rocking gently to maintain circulation. I counted my breaths, each exhale visible in the freezing air, keeping my mind tethered to rational thought. Pain radiated through my back, but I forced myself to focus on micro movements, wiggling a finger, then a hand, testing circulation, assessing damage. The snow acted as both a cushion and a trap cold, seeping in from every side, but I had to use it strategically. I pressed my palms into the snow to push and shift slightly, creating small pockets of movement to relieve stiffness. The initial shock was fading, replaced by a steady, urgent awareness that survival depended on deliberate, controlled action. My training in military basics and logistics was now translated into survival instinct. I visualized each step: stay awake, move deliberately, monitor circulation, keep warm, minimize exposure. The burning cold was constant, a reminder of how quickly a body can fail in extreme conditions. Pain and fear merged, but my determination held. Time slowed, each minute a battle against frostbite and hypothermia, each moment reinforcing the betrayal I had just endured. I kept my eyes on the barracks, knowing the people inside had seen nothing, cared nothing, leaving me to endure alone. My body trembled uncontrollably, but my mind remained alert, cataloging every sensation, every ache, every sharp sting in the limbs. 1 hour stretched interminably, the struggle to maintain consciousness and function gnawed at my mental and physical limits. Yet each breath, each small adjustment, each effort to keep my muscles from seizing was a testament to my will to survive. I thought of the injustices, the manipulation, the years of control and abuse, and allowed that fury to fuel my persistence. I would not succumb to the cold, to the betrayal, to the violence inflicted by someone meant to be family. The storm of snow and the bitter cold seemed endless, but I measured each second as a victory, each small movement a defiance. My body screamed in agony, but my spirit refused to yield, and in that frozen expanse under the indifferent gaze of my stepdad and stepbrother, I made a silent vow: survival justice and eventual retribution. Can you believe someone you trust could do this? Share your thoughts in the comments. I need to hear from you. Pain and cold were constant companions as I lay in the snow, each breath a burning reminder of my vulnerability. My body shivered violently, muscles spasming in protest to the unforgiving 14-degree F air. I knew from my military training that hypothermia could set in faster than most imagined, and once it took hold, survival became a fight against my own body. Instinctively, I began a methodical assessment of my condition, recalling lessons from combat first aid and survival courses I had completed during my logistics assignments. I started with my pulse, placing 2 fingers against my wrist, counting carefully. It was rapid, erratic, but steady enough to know I was alive and capable of responding. I checked my extremities, wiggling my fingers and toes to maintain circulation, pressing lightly against the snow to gauge sensation. Numbness was creeping in from the periphery, yet I refused to let panic override rational action. I tucked my chin, slightly curling into a position that preserved core heat, knowing that every bit of warmth was vital. My shivering intensified, but I reminded myself it was a natural reaction, a protective mechanism, and I allowed it to continue in a controlled manner. I began to plan small, deliberate movements, testing my back and arms to ensure that I could maneuver without worsening any unseen injuries. Each minor adjustment was a negotiation between pain, frostbite risk, and maintaining consciousness. I focused on mental grounding, repeating to myself the fundamentals of survival. Stay awake, monitor pulse, maintain circulation, and avoid exhaustion. Thoughts of the barracks, the indifferent faces behind the frosted windows, fueled a quiet anger that bolstered my determination. I forced my mind to remain sharp, cataloging every ache, every twinge, every icy burn in my skin, treating each as data to guide the next movement. I used my hands to dig shallow indentations in the snow, creating small pockets that offered slight insulation, tiny victories in the battle against the cold. Breathing deeply, I visualized blood flowing to my extremities, imagining warmth returning to fingers and toes, even as the cold relentlessly pressed in. The minutes felt like hours, but I refused to surrender to the sensation of hopelessness. Survival was not just physical, it was mental, and I anchored myself with a fierce resolve that I would not become another casualty of betrayal. Each time my body threatened to shut down, I countered with conscious motion, squeezing my fists, flexing my toes, rolling my shoulders just enough to stimulate circulation. The numbness remained, but I mitigated its advance through persistent, calculated effort. I reminded myself of previous survival drills, the small routines that kept soldiers alive during extreme conditions, and implemented them with precision. I monitored my breathing, keeping it steady despite the pain, focusing on the rhythm as a tether to sanity. Fear surged at intervals, a ghostly whisper urging surrender, yet I transformed it into energy, channeling every ounce of emotion into deliberate action. My mind wandered briefly to thoughts of my stepdad, the betrayal, the cruelty, and each memory sharpened my will. I refused to succumb to the cold, refused to give him the satisfaction of my defeat. I maintained vigilance, scanning the perimeter for any sign of assistance, knowing that self-reliance was my immediate salvation. Hours of concentrated effort distilled into a singular focus: survive, endure, and emerge intact. Every micro-movement, every shiver tolerated, every pulse checked was a testament to my training and willpower. Despite the hypothermia creeping ever closer, I clung to consciousness, reminding myself that giving in, even for a moment, could be fatal. I visualized warmth, light, and rescue, holding those mental images like a lifeline, refusing to let the freezing reality dictate my fate. And in that frozen expanse under the harsh glare of the winter night, I made each second a conscious battle against the cold, against pain, and against the betrayal that had cast me into this snow-laden struggle. My survival instincts, honed by years in the military, became the difference between succumbing and enduring. Each heartbeat, each small, deliberate motion reaffirmed my determination. I would survive this night and justice would follow. Through blurred vision and numbing cold, I lifted my head just enough to glance toward the barracks window, my eyes straining against the icy wind. There they were, my stepdad and stepbrother sitting side by side at the long dinner table, faces illuminated by the warm glow of the overhead lights. My breath came in ragged clouds, yet their focus was utterly elsewhere on their plates, on the laughter and chatter of fellow soldiers, completely indifferent to the frozen figure lying just outside. My chest tightened, a mix of shock and disbelief. How could they ignore me like this after what they had done? Each bite they took felt like a knife. Each sip of water a reminder of their callousness. My mind reeled, trying to reconcile the warmth and normalcy inside with the brutal reality outside. The betrayal cut deeper than the cold. It was deliberate, calculated, a demonstration of control and power. I could see it in their posture, in the subtle smirks, the flicker of satisfaction in Stepdad's eyes, a silent acknowledgement of the control he believed he held over me. The stepbrother's gaze shifted briefly, perhaps noticing the figure outside, but then he returned to his meal, shrugging off any notion of responsibility. My hands trembled not just from frost, but from rage and disbelief. I realized in that moment that the danger was compounded not only by the physical cold, but by the emotional cruelty of being abandoned by those who should have cared, those who claimed family. Public exposure became tangible in my mind. I imagined the other soldiers inside, unaware of the drama unfolding outside the frosted window, unaware that the quiet, obedient figure they had seen in training was now a betrayed human being lying in the snow, vulnerable and alone. This indifference was its own form of violence, a stark contrast to the warmth and security I had been promised, a public display of how completely my family had turned their backs. Every flake of snow that landed on my frozen cheeks seemed to echo the emptiness of their concern. The cold became secondary to the sting of rejection and betrayal, and I felt a surge of clarity. If survival depended on them noticing or intervening, I was doomed. But survival depended on my own will, on my capacity to endure, and that clarity ignited a small spark of defiance. I would not give them the satisfaction of my defeat, nor would I allow their indifference to define the outcome. I shifted slightly, pushing snow beneath me to create a small buffer from the frozen ground, my muscles screaming in protest. I forced my focus onto what I could control, my breathing, my circulation, my thoughts, while observing them, cataloging their expressions, their behaviors, evidence that would one day support the truth of their cruelty. The anger bubbled inside, mixing with the cold and pain, creating a fierce determination that this betrayal would not be the end of my story. I knew that once I survived, once I emerged from this frozen crucible, the world would see them for what they truly were. Every indifferent gesture, every casual laugh, every unbothered glance through the window would become testimony to the public exposure of their cruelty. And in that frozen night outside Fort Drum, as the wind tore at my clothes and the snow threatened to overwhelm, I understood that survival was not just about heat or pulse or circulation. It was about witnessing their indifference and letting it fuel the fire that would carry me through the night. Each heartbeat was a promise I would endure, I would expose, and I would reclaim the dignity they had tried to strip away. The cold and betrayal combined into a singular, piercing clarity. They had abandoned me physically and emotionally, but they could not break my resolve. I would survive this hour, and when I did, the world would know their faces, their cruelty, and the moment they chose indifference over humanity. The public exposure moment was theirs in a twisted sense, but I was determined to turn it into my own story of justice, strength, and ultimate vindication. As I shivered on the snow-covered ground outside Fort Drum, my mind drifted back to the earliest memories of my childhood, a series of lessons in control and domination that had been drilled into me long before I ever imagined a military life. Stepdad had been there since I was 6, a constant presence with a meticulous eye for my every movement. Meals were scheduled to the minute. What I ate carefully monitored for calories and etiquette. If I lingered too long at the table, his gaze would pin me like an animal in a trap, and I learned quickly that hesitation invited correction. Sleep was regimented with military-like precision lights, out at the exact hour, blankets tucked, just so, a silence enforced that felt more like a prison than a home. Even my schoolwork was subject to his oversight. Homework completed in his presence or under his watchful eye. Grades, scrutinized, explanations demanded any deviation, punished with verbal lashings or cold stares that froze me more effectively than the winter winds outside could ever hope to. I remembered the countless nights lying awake, listening to the rhythmic tick of the clock, calculating each movement, each breath, lest I provoke his wrath. It was a life of constant surveillance, of learning to anticipate his moods, like a soldier, anticipating orders from a commanding officer. And yet, within that structure, I discovered my first instincts of rebellion, small acts, subtle but deliberate, that gave me a sense of control. A misaligned book on the shelf, a slightly faster dash to the school bus, a whispered refusal disguised as compliance. These were my tiny victories, the beginnings of my own strategic defiance. By the time I turned 12, I had learned to encode my acts of independence, hiding them in plain sight while he believed his control was absolute. I would slip notes to my mother before she passed, detailing my plans to exercise autonomy to preserve some small piece of myself, only for her to be dismissed a casualty of his manipulative oversight. At 15, I began to understand the psychology behind his control. Every rule, every sharp reprimand, every sudden smile followed by a scowl was a test designed to mold me into submission. And I, determined not to be molded, developed a mental map of his behaviors, memorizing patterns, predicting outbursts, and planning my countermoves. By 18, when I enlisted in the military, it was not just an act of service. It was my first true assertion of independence. I left behind the familiar prison of Stepdad's meticulous oversight, trading it for the regimented freedom of military life, where control existed but was predictable and honorable. The memory of those early lessons haunted me now as I lay in the snow, muscles stiff and teeth chattering, yet it also fueled my resolve. Each strategy I had devised as a child, each clever act of defiance had prepared me for this night. I knew how to survive scrutiny, how to anticipate threats, how to endure suffering without surrendering my will. The abuse pattern that had shaped my youth had unintentionally trained me for this very moment, outside the barracks battling the cold, the pain, and the indifference of those who should have protected me. And within that bitter reflection, I found a measure of empathy for the woman I had been cautious, calculating, forced to grow up too quickly, yet resourceful enough to outlast the cruelty. Those early experiences of controlled meals, regimented sleep, and monitored education were not just memories. They were the blueprint for resilience, the foundation upon which I would build the courage to survive and one day to seek justice. Each flashback reinforced the realization that my stepdad's pattern of control, so meticulously enforced, could not crush the determination embedded deep within me. The seeds of defiance planted in childhood had grown into the strength I relied on now, 1 hour in 14-degree Fahrenheit snow, shivering but alive, ready to endure and to confront the betrayal that awaited justice. The biting wind cut through my uniform like knives, and every shiver threatened to drag me into unconsciousness. Yet then I heard the faint crunch of boots on the snow that did not belong to the stepdad or stepbrother. A figure emerged from the dim glow of the barracks lights, moving deliberately toward me, carrying a bag that suggested preparedness, urgency, and care. It was Margaret, my former mentor from basic training, a retired officer who had always taken a particular interest in my development. The sight of her face, lined but resolute, sent a rush of relief through my frozen body, and for the first time since the shove, I allowed a breath to escape my constricted lungs. She knelt beside me, immediately ignoring the cold herself, and pressed a gloved hand to my shoulder. Her touch was firm but not forceful, grounding me against the panic that threatened to overtake my rational mind. "Lauren, stay with me," she said sharply, eyes scanning my face, reading the frostbite, the paleness, the signs of hypothermia that my own military training had made me acutely aware of. I tried to respond, words muffled by teeth chattering and the sting of the cold, but she did not need my compliance. She acted with experience, gently rolling me onto my side to maintain warmth and prevent further injury. Margaret's presence was immediate validation that I was not invisible, that my suffering was seen, and that action would be taken. She spoke calmly, instructing me to focus on breathing, to follow the rhythm of her voice, and to ignore the pain radiating through my back and legs. Her other hand fumbled in the bag and retrieved a thermal blanket, wrapping it around me with careful precision, creating a fragile barrier against the brutal air. "You're going to be okay, but you have to stay awake. Don't let the snow take you under," she said, her tone both commanding and reassuring. The irony was not lost on me. Years of surviving strict oversight and calculated abuse had culminated in this fight against nature and neglect, and now a single person outside of my immediate tormentors had become the lifeline I desperately needed. Margaret dialed 911 on her phone while still holding my shoulder, providing clear, concise details about my condition location and the dangerous circumstances that led to my fall. I caught fragments of her conversation: emergency medical services frostbite, fall from height, Barracks, Stepdad involvement. Each word intensified the gravity of the situation, but paradoxically, it also brought clarity. I realized that despite the indifference of those who should have cared, the system could respond, and allies existed outside my immediate circle of betrayal. As we waited, she kept me engaged in conversation, recounting light memories from training, asking questions about my immediate reactions to cold, prompting me to move fingers and toes to maintain circulation. The combination of care focus and subtle distraction worked. I could feel my mental fog slowly lifting, the panic receding as I clung to consciousness with Margaret's assistance. Every vehicle light that swept across the snowy parking lot was met with a tense hope that it was EMS, and when the first siren cut through the night, relief washed over me like a tidal wave. Yet beneath that relief lingered the bitter taste of betrayal, knowing that the people responsible for my suffering were steps away, indifferent. Margaret's steady presence, however, gave me strength to confront that truth without breaking entirely. She whispered reminders of my training, my resilience, and my ability to survive. I clung to each word, each gloved hand on my shoulder, as if they were lifelines thrown into a raging storm. The sirens grew louder, the red and blue lights reflecting off the barracks windows, casting long shadows over the snow and ice. Paramedics leaped from the vehicles, rushing toward us with blankets, stretchers, and emergency equipment. Margaret stepped back only slightly, ensuring I remained aware and responsive, helping the medics understand my injuries and the dangerous exposure I had endured. I felt the warmth of their blankets and the firmness of their hands lifting me from the unforgiving snow. But Margaret stayed close, a guardian, until I was fully under their care. As we moved towards the ambulance, I glimpsed the barracks through the haze of frost and flashing lights, imagining the shock they would feel once word spread. The betrayal that had marked my life until this moment would not go unnoticed. And as the doors of the ambulance closed around me, Margaret's eyes met mine, a silent message. You are not alone, and justice, in its own way, is beginning to unfold. CTA, who has ever pulled you out of a nightmare? Share your story in the comments below. The wail of the ambulance siren was deafening against the silent expanse of snow-covered barracks, yet somehow it felt like the first true sound of hope I had heard in hours. The paramedics leapt out efficiently and methodically, assessing the scene, their breath visible in the freezing night air as they approached. Margaret quickly stepped aside, but her presence remained a constant reassurance as the professionals crouched beside me. One of them placed gloved hands on my shoulders, gently rolling me to assess spinal alignment, while the other checked my pulse and breathing. My military training kicked in instantly. I monitored my own vitals in my head, noting the rapid heartbeat, shallow breaths, and numbing fingers and toes from frostbite. The paramedics murmured observations to one another. Possible spinal compression, several rib fractures, severe exposure to hypothermia. I could feel the weight of their judgment, each movement deliberate to avoid worsening injuries. As they worked, I found myself mentally guiding them in ways my training had taught me. Keep her neck stable, I thought, visualizing the steps a military medic would take, aware that panic or misalignment could cause permanent damage. They listened attentively as Margaret relayed the sequence of events, emphasizing the fall, the exposure to extreme cold, and the duration of my time in the snow. I could sense my survival depended not just on their medical skill, but on the accuracy of the information provided. The stretcher arrived and they carefully lifted me, securing straps around my torso and legs, checking for pressure points and alignment. Every touch sent jolts of pain through fractured ribs, but I reminded myself to remain still, to focus on controlling my body, and to use mental imagery to distract from the shock. The ambulance doors closed, sealing me inside a heated cocoon of controlled urgency. I could hear monitors beeping softly, the paramedics' calm instructions, and the subtle hum of the engine as they sped toward the ER. Maintain circulation, focus on breathing. Stay conscious, I reminded myself, eyes fixed on the ceiling teeth, chattering despite the blankets. My fingers moved deliberately to prevent frostbite from worsening, recalling precise techniques I had practiced in survival and field medical courses. Upon arrival, the doors burst open and a team of ER nurses and physicians swarmed in, moving with precise choreography. Heat packs were deployed monitors attached to track oxygen saturation, blood pressure, and cardiac rhythm. An IV line was inserted fluids running through my veins to counteract the cold-induced hypovolemia. The ER smelled faintly of antiseptic and warm air, a stark contrast to the frigid snow outside. A nurse checked my temperature, muttering concern about hypothermia, while a doctor examined my back and ribs, carefully palpating for signs of spinal compromise. I felt every touch, each one amplified by pain, but my mental focus remained unwavering. I mentally coached myself through each step: stay, still remain alert, communicate clearly, control pain, perception. The team worked with urgency yet precision, acknowledging my attempts to cooperate and stabilize myself. The IV fluid warmed my core, the heat packs on my extremities brought immediate relief, and the monitors displayed slowly normalizing vitals. Margaret hovered nearby, speaking quietly to me, reinforcing grounding techniques I had learned in military training: breathing exercises, visualizing warm environments, mentally mapping injuries to prevent panic. Despite the fear, the cold, and the pain, I felt a strange empowerment. I was applying my knowledge in real time, actively participating in my own survival. The ER staff exchanged glances, nodding to each other with quiet professionalism, aware that I had endured prolonged exposure and trauma. Every movement, every assessment was a collaboration between my body, my mind, and their expertise. Even through the pain and the shock, I observed the efficiency and care, internalizing it as part of the narrative of my survival. I knew the next steps would involve imaging possible spinal scans and monitoring for frostbite complications, but at that moment, I felt alive, grounded, and supported. The contrast between the chaos of the fall and the calm precision of the ER created a surreal mix of fear and relief. I could hear the faint voices of staff as they relayed information, and Margaret's constant presence reminded me that I was not alone in this fight. Mental grounding, survival training, and immediate medical care merged into a delicate dance that kept me conscious and aware, every breath a testament to resilience and preparation. The sense of betrayal from my stepdad and stepbrother lingered in the background, but for the first time since the shove, I felt the possibility of justice and recovery, of being seen, cared for, and eventually of reclaiming control. The morning after the ER chaos, the weight of what had happened did not lift. It only shifted into a new battlefield of investigation. I sat on the hospital bed, still shivering from residual hypothermia, my hands wrapped around a warm cup of tea while my mind raced over the events of Christmas Eve. Margaret had insisted I document everything I remembered, every detail, every look, every word exchanged in the barracks before the shove. My military training kicked in again. I knew the importance of evidence, of creating a record that would withstand scrutiny and lead to accountability. I started with the barracks security cameras. Fort Drum had a comprehensive surveillance system, and with permission from base command, footage was pulled, showing the hallway outside the dining area. There it was, crystal clear, Stepdad watching my every move as I navigated the barracks corridor, his eyes tracking my hands, my shoulders, even the slight tremor from exhaustion. Stepbrother lingered near the doorway, smirking as he nudged a tray slightly to distract me, an act that seemed minor but clearly provoked Stepdad. The sequence was undeniable. Stepdad's facial expression shifted from irritation to anger, a brief but unmistakable flash of malice before he opened the window and pushed. Watching it frame by frame, my stomach churned, but a sense of clarity settled in. I had proof that this was not an accident. I documented timestamps, camera angles, and cross-referenced with the exact times Margaret had called EMS. Next came messages. Stepbrother, in a lapse of judgment, had sent a flippant text to a friend that evening. "Watch what happens to Lauren tonight. Dad's gonna show her who's boss." Screenshot after screenshot, the intent was glaring. Every word, emoji, and timestamp reinforced the narrative that this was premeditated. I compiled it into a single chronological file ready to submit to the military legal office. Social media posts added further context. Stepbrother had posted innocuous holiday photos of the Barracks dining hall captions joking about Christmas chaos and family fun, not realizing the irony and incrimination these seemingly harmless posts carried. I cross-referenced the photos with the video footage and messages, creating a multi-layered evidentiary network, each piece connected, telling a story that left no room for denial. Margaret helped me organize the documents and footage, advising on the order that would make the impact undeniable to investigators. She reminded me that clarity and thoroughness were critical. Half measures would allow Stepdad to twist the narrative. My hands trembled as I watched the video again, focusing on the exact moment of the shove, noting Stepdad's body language, a deliberate step forward, a steady hand on the window frame, and the calculated shove that sent me falling into the snow below. There was no hesitation, no reflexive reaction, just intent. I recorded my own voiceover observations describing sensations, timing, and my attempts to stay conscious during the fall. Stepbrother's confession came in a tense exchange over the phone later that morning. Initially defensive, he crumbled when I calmly referenced the text evidence and security footage. I didn't think he'd actually do it, he admitted, voice shaking. I was just joking. I didn't think it would go this far. His words, though hesitant, confirmed the chain of events and the culpability of both Stepdad and Stepbrother. I included this transcript in my evidence file, ensuring investigators could see that even those involved recognized the deliberate nature of the act. I also detailed the environmental factors: temperature, snow, risk of hypothermia, and timing of EMS arrival to highlight the real danger I faced. Medical reports from the ER supported this, showing spinal compression risk, fractured ribs, and early-stage frostbite, corroborating the life-threatening circumstances. Each piece of evidence reinforced the central claim: Stepdad's actions were intentional, reckless, and malicious. I compiled everything into a comprehensive report, organized for the military legal office with copies to the base command and my attorney. I paused to reflect on the process, realizing that gathering this evidence was more than a procedural step, it was reclaiming my power. After months of psychological control, monitoring, and abuse, I was finally in a position to expose the truth, to confront the betrayal, and to ensure justice would be served. The combination of security footage, confessions, messages, social media posts, and medical documentation created a mosaic that could not be ignored. This was the moment where planning, patience, and mental fortitude converged. The scales of justice were tipping, and for the first time since the shove, I felt a sense of agency and satisfaction. The public exposure, even if limited initially to military authorities, was imminent, and I knew the story would eventually reach a wider audience. I had survived the shove, survived the cold, and now I was ensuring that the betrayal, the abuse, and the recklessness of my stepdad and stepbrother would be confronted and accounted for. Justice, once elusive, was now tangible, and the steps I took in evidence gathering guaranteed that it could not be evaded or denied. Every detail mattered. Every timestamp and confession was a brick in the foundation of accountability. And as I finalized the report, I felt a quiet, resolute satisfaction, knowing that the truth was indisputable and that revenge in its purest form, through exposure and justice, was within reach. The morning light filtered coldly through the blinds of the military legal office at Fort Drum, New York. I sat stiffly in the witness area, my uniform pressed and neat, my mind a whirlwind of adrenaline and anticipation. The events of Christmas Eve still replayed in sharp, vivid flashes, but now the focus had shifted from survival to confrontation. Stepdad and stepbrother were there, seated side by side, their postures rigid, faces pale with the unease of those caught in undeniable wrongdoing. The weight of the room was palpable, a mix of military precision and the gravity of the legal process. Judge Colonel Sanders, a stern woman in her early 60s, with a reputation for fairness and zero tolerance for abuse, entered first, her boots echoing against the linoleum floor. Everyone stood as she took her seat, then slowly nodded for us to sit. The prosecutor, Lieutenant Marquez, a sharp-minded officer in her 40s, began setting out the case. She outlined the charges: reckless endangerment, assault, and abuse of authority, making it clear that the evidence was substantial. Security footage, medical reports, witness testimonies, and text messages had all been compiled, leaving little room for manipulation. I felt a tremor of satisfaction. Months of preparation, documentation, and emotional endurance had led to this moment. Stepdad attempted to maintain a calm facade, but I could see the flicker of panic in his eyes as the prosecutor detailed the security footage showing him deliberately shoving me from the second-floor window. Stepbrother shifted uncomfortably beside him, eyes darting toward the screen that displayed timestamps of his incriminating texts and messages. Witnesses began to arrive in a steady stream. My ally, Margaret, had taken the stand first. Her calm, authoritative voice recounting how she had discovered me in the snow, ensured my safety, and coordinated EMS. Her testimony painted a clear picture of my struggle to survive, reinforcing the seriousness of the shove and the potential consequences of hypothermia and frostbite. Fellow soldiers who had witnessed my interactions with stepdad and stepbrother in the days leading up to the incident provided supporting testimonies highlighting the pattern of intimidation and control that had persisted over the years. Each voice strengthened the narrative that this was not an isolated lapse in judgment, but a deliberate act born of a history of abuse and domination. As the witnesses recounted the events, I felt a mixture of relief and power. I was finally being heard, and the truth of what had transpired was undeniable. Stepdad's attempts to interject to offer explanations that framed the shove as a minor accident were systematically dismantled by the evidence. The video footage showed his intent clearly. The medical reports confirmed the real danger I faced. Stepbrother's earlier confession also reinforced the account, making their denials impotent. I was called to the stand. Standing before the judge, I felt the familiar rush of military discipline grounding me. I recounted the night, my voice steady, despite the memory of pain and cold. I described the shove, the fall, the freezing temperatures, and the desperate struggle to survive for 1 hour before EMS arrived. I detailed the emotional betrayal of seeing stepdad and stepbrother remain indifferent, continuing their dinner as if nothing had happened. Each word was measured precise and imbued with the authority of someone trained to observe, survive, and document. The courtroom was silent, hanging on every detail. My testimony, paired with the corroborating evidence, left little doubt about the gravity of the situation and the deliberate actions of the accused. The prosecutor emphasized the public exposure aspect, how the military community needed to witness accountability for abuse, how no soldier, regardless of rank or relationship, was above responsibility. I could see the tension in stepdad's shoulders, the tightening of his jaw, the realization that manipulation and intimidation would no longer protect him. Stepbrother's eyes avoided mine entirely, an unspoken acknowledgement of guilt and fear. As the session continued, the judge methodically ensured that all testimonies and evidence were presented in a way that maintained procedural fairness while making the narrative crystal clear. The structure of the courtroom, the judge's authority, the presence of legal personnel, the witnesses amplified the emotional weight of the exposure. Public exposure, not just in the literal sense, but as a psychological reckoning, was unfolding. I felt a mixture of validation and catharsis. Months of abuse control and fear were now being laid bare in a structured, undeniable legal framework. The story I had lived and documented was now in the hands of the judicial system, and the consequences for my stepdad and stepbrother were imminent. The courtroom setup had achieved its purpose. It established the stage for the coming testimonies, the unveiling of undeniable truth, and the delivery of justice that had long been delayed. Every detail, the positioning of the accused, the sequence of witnesses, the methodical presentation of evidence, served to reinforce the reality of the events, the recklessness of the assault, and the inevitability of accountability. In that room, with the eyes of military justice upon us, I realized that survival had moved beyond the physical. This was a reclaiming of agency, dignity, and truth in the most public, undeniable way possible. The courtroom air was heavy with anticipation as the first witness was called forward. Sergeant Daniels, a fellow logistics officer who had been stationed on Fort Drum for over a decade, took the stand. He was a man of quiet authority, his voice steady as he recounted the Christmas Eve events. He described seeing me near the second-floor barracks window, shivering from the cold, my uniform coated lightly with frost. He recounted the precise moment he saw stepdad push me through the window. The force and intent unmistakable. Every detail was methodically conveyed, the positioning of stepdad's hands, the reaction on my face, and the fall itself. The words struck like a hammer, each one reinforcing the reality that this was not an accident but a deliberate act. As he spoke, I watched Stepdad's face contort with a mixture of shame and calculated concern. Once the witness was excused, the prosecutor shifted focus, calling Stepbrother to testify. He entered the room with a hesitant gait, clearly anxious under the scrutiny of the military courtroom. The judge's stern gaze pinned him in place as he was sworn in. Stepbrother's voice wavered initially as he described the events, eventually admitting his role in provoking tensions that had escalated the situation. He confessed to sending messages to Stepdad earlier that evening, messages intended to trigger a reaction to intimidate me and to support the stepdad's abusive pattern. His testimony confirmed the deliberate nature of the shove, leaving no ambiguity. The courtroom audience, composed of fellow soldiers, legal officers, and a few base personnel, listened intently. The weight of betrayal was palpable. The combination of familial authority and military rank had allowed Stepdad and Stepbrother to manipulate and control, and now the truth was being publicly revealed. After Stepbrother's testimony, the prosecutor allowed Stepdad to address the court. His face was pale, eyes flicking between me and the assembled witnesses. With a trembling voice, he attempted to frame his actions as a momentary lapse of judgment, a miscalculation in authority, a mistake he regretted. He pleaded for forgiveness, attempting to appeal to my sense of compassion. The audacity of the act, the attempt to shift responsibility and manipulate the narrative, even in front of undeniable evidence, was almost grotesque. I took a slow, deliberate breath before responding. Standing voice, clear and unwavering, I addressed the court and Stepdad directly. I recounted the physical, emotional, and psychological pain caused by his actions and the hour I had spent in 14-degree Fahrenheit temperatures struggling to survive alone. I spoke of the years of manipulation, control, and intimidation, of the patterns that had followed me from childhood into my adult life in the military. I made it clear that forgiveness was not an option. Trust had been irreparably broken, and the consequences of his actions must be fully acknowledged and carried out. The courtroom was silent, every person present absorbing the magnitude of my words. Stepdad's shoulders sagged slightly, and for the first time I saw the unmasked weight of guilt and fear. The public exposure moment reached its peak, those who had turned a blind eye to abuse, the soldiers who respected authority blindly, and the family members complicit in silence were now witnesses to truth, accountability, and the unflinching courage of a survivor. As the tension settled slightly, the prosecutor turned to the remaining witnesses who had seen or been involved peripherally. Their statements corroborated the events and the psychological patterns leading up to the shove, adding layers of validation to my testimony. Each narrative emphasized that this was a deliberate act, not a fluke of circumstance. The judge observed intently, occasionally taking notes, her presence reinforcing the seriousness and credibility of the proceedings. Stepbrother, sitting beside Stepdad, now bore the weight of his complicity. His earlier nervous demeanor shifted to one of resigned acknowledgement. The reality of legal consequences and the public revelation of family betrayal settled firmly over both men. I felt a complex wave of emotions: vindication, rage, relief, and a lingering sadness that familial bonds could be so utterly corrupted by control and abuse. The testimony phase had achieved its purpose. The truth was laid bare, the patterns of abuse exposed, and my refusal to accept apology or manipulation underscored the theme of audacity and resilience. Public exposure was complete, the emotional undulation reaching its apex as the court prepared to move into the next phase: verdict and sentencing. For the first time since the shove, I felt the full weight of justice in motion, knowing that the systematic abuse, the manipulation, and the violence would no longer remain hidden behind the facade of family loyalty or military hierarchy. The court had seen the raw reality of betrayal and courage, and the stage was set for closure, accountability, and the restoration of moral order. The courtroom was thick with anticipation as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. The air felt charged, a mixture of tension and relief permeating the room. Stepdad sat rigidly, his hands clenched on the bench jaw, tight eyes darting nervously between the judge and me. Stepbrother shifted uneasily beside him, his earlier bravado from provoking the incident completely gone, replaced by a raw sense of apprehension. The judge cleared her throat and began to speak, her tone steady, commanding, and resolute. She meticulously recounted the facts presented over the past days, highlighting the testimonies of witnesses, the stepbrother's admission, the recorded text messages, and the surveillance footage from the barracks. Every detail of the shove, the calculated nature of the act, and the prolonged exposure to freezing temperatures were emphasized, leaving no room for ambiguity. She acknowledged the extreme breach of trust, the manipulation of familial authority, and the abuse of military rank, framing it as both a personal and professional failure. Stepdad's face paled further as she began outlining the sentence. He was to face confinement within the military base's disciplinary facility for a determined period, a severe reprimand formally recorded in his personnel file, and strict restrictions on his interactions with any personnel under his authority. Furthermore, mandatory counseling and anger management sessions were imposed, emphasizing rehabilitation alongside accountability. Stepbrother's sentence was delivered separately. Although younger and less culpable, his role in provoking and enabling the abuse was acknowledged. He was assigned community service on base formal counseling and mandatory participation in educational programs addressing manipulation, intimidation, and the consequences of coercive behavior. The judge stressed that his cooperation with the investigation and full acknowledgement of his complicity would be crucial to his path toward redemption. As the sentences were read, a palpable sense of catharsis washed over the courtroom. The audience, composed of fellow service members, legal staff, and a few family members, visibly reacted to the resolution. Gasps of acknowledgement, murmurs of approval, and subtle nods punctuated the room as the consequences of years of control abuse and betrayal became tangible. I sat still, absorbing the weight of justice finally being enacted. The relief was complex. There was satisfaction, a sense of closure, but also lingering pain from the years of manipulation and fear. Every shiver from that hour in 14-degree weather, every moment of betrayal, and every ounce of courage had led to this moment. I could feel the metaphorical chains of oppression loosening, the stepdad's authority and influence over my life finally diminished. In that instant, the emotional undulation peaked, shock and fear transitioned into righteous anger, then into measured satisfaction and empowerment. The public exposure had reached its full effect, and justice was now indisputably served. The judge adjourned the court, and the spectators began to disperse, many casting approving glances my way. I stood, legs slightly trembling from the tension, and allowed myself a long, steady breath. The stepdad was led away under supervision, his gaze briefly meeting mine, reflecting a mix of remorse and resignation. Stepbrother followed, equally subdued, and the weight of consequence pressed upon him. I felt a surge of triumph tempered by the gravity of the experience. Every manipulation, every attempt to intimidate or control me had been countered with undeniable accountability. The months of planning, resilience, and self-preservation had culminated in a clear message: abuse and betrayal would not go unchallenged. And the system, though slow and deliberate, had acted to restore moral and legal balance. Outside the courtroom, I took a moment alone, allowing the enormity of the moment to settle in. The snow outside reminded me of the night I had fallen, of the hour spent fighting for survival in frigid temperatures, and the depth of indifference I had endured. Now those memories were tinged with a new light, a sense of empowerment and reclamation. Justice had been served, the public exposure validated the truth, and the audacity of the stepdad and stepbrother had been met with tangible, unequivocal consequences. I realized that the path forward was mine to define, no longer dictated by fear or manipulation. For the first time in years, the weight of control that had loomed over me was gone, replaced by clarity, resilience, and the knowledge that survival, physical, emotional, and moral, was possible. The verdict and sentencing were not just legal resolutions. They were symbolic victories affirming the strength of courage, the necessity of accountability, and the ultimate power of standing firm in the face of betrayal. The days following the courtroom verdict were a delicate balance between physical healing and emotional reckoning. I woke each morning in the military medical facility, the residual ache in my back and ribs, a constant reminder of that harrowing night, yet also a testament to my survival. Physical therapy became my anchor, a structured series of exercises designed to restore strength, mobility, and confidence in my own body. Each session was painstaking, lifting my arms, walking across the rehab room. Simple stretches that once seemed trivial now felt like monumental victories. Margaret, my mentor and ally, was there every step of the way. Her calm presence and steady encouragement helped bridge the gap between fear and resilience. She reminded me that healing was not a linear journey, that setbacks did not erase progress, and that my trauma did not define my capacity to reclaim control over my life. We spent hours discussing coping strategies for the lingering anxiety the flashbacks triggered by the smallest cues, a door slamming a raised voice, or even the sight of a second-story window. Nighttime was particularly challenging. My mind replayed the shove, the cold, the sense of abandonment. I learned grounding techniques, breathing exercises, and cognitive reframing methods drawn from both military protocols and psychological guidance, all aimed at reducing hypervigilance and restoring a sense of safety. Integration back into the base environment was another hurdle. Each corridor, every barracks stairwell, and the dining hall where my stepdad and stepbrother had once shown their indifference became spaces charged with memories. I approached these areas cautiously observing my reactions, allowing myself to pause, and consciously reaffirming that the authority they once wielded over me had been nullified. The support of the medical staff, the counselors, and Margaret created a safe network. I attended group therapy sessions with fellow service members who had faced familial conflict or base-related stress, sharing experiences and strategies for resilience. Slowly, I began to recognize patterns of control and manipulation, not just in my stepdad and stepbrother, but in ways I had internalized over the years. Acknowledging these patterns was painful yet liberating. It allowed me to reclaim autonomy over my responses and decisions. Military reintegration was phased and deliberate. I resumed my role in logistics, incrementally taking on tasks that leveraged my skills without overwhelming my recovering body or psyche. The sense of purpose in contributing to base operations was grounding. It reminded me of my competence and capacity for responsibility, independent of familial dynamics. Over time, I began to notice shifts in my emotional landscape. The acute shock and anger gradually softened into a steady awareness of my strength and resilience. I could recall the shove, the frigid hour on the ground, the indifference of my family without being paralyzed by it. Memories remained vivid but were reframed as markers of survival rather than perpetual trauma. Self-care became a critical component of recovery. I prioritized rest, nutrition, and moments of quiet reflection, allowing my body to heal while nurturing a renewed sense of agency. Margaret encouraged journaling, reinforcing the narrative of my own courage and tactical response during the crisis. Each entry became a testament to my ability to endure, adapt, and emerge stronger. Social reintegration outside the immediate military environment required careful navigation. I reconnected with trusted friends and colleagues, sharing my story selectively, finding validation and solidarity without exposing myself to judgment or pity. These interactions reinforced that I was not defined by the violence inflicted upon me, but by my response, resilience, and commitment to reclaiming my life. As weeks turned into months, the synergy of physical therapy, emotional counseling, mentorship, and disciplined reintegration fostered a profound sense of recovery. I could walk past the barracks window without flinching, participate in daily duties with renewed confidence, and engage with my peers in authentic, unguarded ways. The combination of personal courage, structured military support, and unwavering mentorship created a foundation from which I could rebuild not only my physical well-being, but my sense of identity, empowerment, and purpose. This period was not about erasing the trauma, it was about contextualizing it, acknowledging its impact, and transforming the experience into a source of strength. By the time I completed my recovery program, I felt a renewed ownership of my life, armed with skills, insight, and resilience that ensured the actions of my stepdad and stepbrother would never again dictate my sense of safety, capability, or self-worth. The recovery arc had not only restored my body, but fortified my spirit, reaffirming that survival justice and personal empowerment could coexist even after unimaginable betrayal. In the quiet moments after my physical recovery, I found myself reflecting on the full weight of what had happened and the power I had regained. Standing on the base grounds at Fort Drum, the crisp winter air filled my lungs and reminded me of every choice I had made to survive, to endure, and to reclaim authority over my life. For the first time in decades, I recognized that my stepdad no longer held any power over me. The courtroom verdict and the separation enforced by military justice had legally removed his control, but beyond that, I felt it in my bones, in the steady rhythm of my heartbeat, in the calm of my mind as I navigated spaces that once triggered fear. I realized empowerment was not merely about being free from others' control, but about understanding my own agency and asserting it confidently in every aspect of my life. The years of manipulation and abuse had conditioned me to second-guess my instincts, but the survival instincts I had honed during that frigid hour beneath the barracks window reminded me that I was capable of decisive action even under extreme duress. That realization became my guiding principle. With this renewed sense of self, I began to chart a life that prioritized my autonomy, well-being, and professional growth. I sought positions within the base that allowed me to exercise authority, mentor younger service members, and influence operational decisions. Transitioning into a management role in logistics enabled me to take ownership of projects, enforce standards, and lead teams effectively, all while maintaining a safe emotional distance from the lingering shadows of my stepdad and stepbrother. I also explored opportunities to serve as a medical officer, integrating my military medical training with hands-on leadership supporting personnel with both physical and psychological challenges. Each day, I reminded myself that these choices were acts of defiance and reclamation, a tangible demonstration that I was no longer bound by fear or familial manipulation. Reflecting on my journey, I understood that empowerment was also about narrative control. I began to document my experiences not for sensationalism, but to acknowledge the reality of survival, to honor my own resilience, and to serve as a guide for others navigating similar betrayals. Sharing lessons about boundary setting, situational awareness, and the practical application of military training reinforced my autonomy and allowed me to turn past trauma into actionable insight. My sense of identity shifted profoundly. I was no longer Lauren Keating, defined by a stepdad's cruelty or childhood constraints. I was a leader, a survivor, a woman who had confronted extreme adversity and emerged with clarity, strength, and purpose. In every interaction, I exercised discernment, choosing who to trust and how to invest my energy. Each professional achievement, every successful project completion, and every life I mentored contributed to a growing internal validation that surpassed any need for external approval. Revenge, in its purest form, had already occurred, not through vengeance, but through transformation. The stepdad who had once exerted control was irrelevant to the version of myself that I had created. Justice was not only in the legal verdict, but also in the consistent demonstration of my capability, resilience, and independence. As weeks turned into months, the psychological weight that once clouded my thoughts began to lift. I noticed the subtle shifts in my posture, the confident tone in my voice, and the ease with which I navigated challenging situations. Empowerment was no longer theoretical. It was embodied in my actions, decisions, and the environments I chose to inhabit. This phase of reflection also allowed me to acknowledge the complexity of human relationships. While I had cut ties with toxic influences, I cultivated supportive connections that reinforced healthy boundaries. I engaged with colleagues, mentors, and friends who respected my experiences and offered guidance without judgment. This network became a testament to the life I was consciously creating, a life characterized by intentionality, respect, and mutual accountability. Importantly, I recognized that personal growth was not a destination, but a continuous process. Each challenge I faced, each leadership decision I made, and each moment of self-reflection contributed to a deeper understanding of my values and priorities. I internalized the lesson that surviving trauma is one thing, but thriving beyond it requires deliberate choices, self-discipline, and unwavering commitment to one's principles. By the end of this period, I could walk past the barracks where the shove had occurred without flinching. I could sit in the mess hall without experiencing panic or anger at the memory. I had redefined the spaces of my past trauma as markers of strength rather than sources of fear. Looking forward, I committed to mentoring other service members who might face similar challenges, offering guidance rooted in lived experience, tactical knowledge, and emotional intelligence. My personal growth, therefore, extended beyond individual empowerment. It became a model for communal resilience and leadership. Ultimately, the reflection revealed a profound truth. Revenge and justice were not solely acts imposed on others, but were realized through the reclamation of self. I had survived the shove, endured the hypothermia, navigated the courtroom, and emerged not only physically intact, but psychologically fortified. I had reclaimed my narrative, reinforced my autonomy, and established a life defined by strength, purpose, and the knowledge that no one could ever again diminish my agency or dictate my worth. Standing on the snowy grounds of Fort Drum, I gazed up at the barracks where it all had happened, the second-floor window now silent and unassuming under the pale winter light. The same structure that had once been the site of fear, betrayal, and near death now appeared ordinary, almost mundane, yet every detail carried the weight of memory. I traced the path of the fall in my mind, the sharp shock of impact against the cold, hard snow, the numbing wind biting at my skin, and the overwhelming sense of abandonment as I realized my stepdad and stepbrother had left me there without a second thought. Yet, standing there today, I felt none of the terror that had once seized me. Instead, I felt a profound sense of triumph and resilience. This window, once a symbol of danger and control, had become a marker of my survival, a testament to the strength I had cultivated both physically and mentally. I reflected on the long months of recovery therapy and reflection, remembering the nights shivering in the snow and the slow, painful regaining of trust in myself. Every ache in my body, every cautious step in my rehabilitation had contributed to a renewed awareness of my self-worth. I realized that fear could never be fully erased, but it could be transformed into vigilance, empowerment, and clarity. As I looked at the barracks, I also considered the independence I had forged through years of military service education and personal growth. The courage it had taken to speak up, pursue justice, and reclaim my autonomy could not be undone by those who had sought to harm me. I felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that the individuals who had tried to control and intimidate me were now held accountable, and that I had emerged with not only survival but also authority over my life. My thoughts wandered to the lessons embedded in this experience. The importance of trusting one's instincts, setting boundaries, and refusing to accept abuse under any circumstance. I recognized that resilience was not a fleeting moment of courage, but a sustained practice of self-respect, self-protection, and self-determination. As I walked past the entrance, I glanced back once more at the window and the barracks facade. It no longer evoked fear or resentment. Instead, it was a symbol of victory, a visual representation of how far I had come. Each brick, each pane of glass, each shadow cast by the afternoon sun reminded me of the journey I had undertaken and the power I had reclaimed. I considered the wider implications of my experience not just for myself, but for others who might face similar trials. The narrative of overcoming betrayal, abuse, and negligence resonated with the understanding that empowerment and self-worth are born from action awareness and the courage to claim one's narrative. I felt a sense of closure knowing that the story of that night was no longer solely about danger and fear, but about survival, justice, and growth. The barracks, once a site of traumatic memory, had become a landmark of personal transformation. I drew in a deep breath, feeling the crisp winter air fill my lungs and the steady warmth of my own heartbeat. In that moment, I understood the full extent of my independence. I was no longer defined by the actions of my stepdad or stepbrother, nor by the circumstances of that cold night. I was defined by my resilience, by my ability to endure, to act decisively, and to thrive in the aftermath of adversity. I allowed myself a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. The fear, shock, and betrayal that had once seemed insurmountable were now chapters in a narrative of empowerment. I knew that this experience had permanently altered the lens through which I viewed myself and the world, and in a way that was profoundly positive. Standing there, I felt gratitude for my training, for the allies who had helped me, and for the inner strength I had cultivated through every challenge. The barracks window, once a symbol of loss of control and terror, now represented a personal milestone, an emblem of my resilience, independence, and unwavering sense of self-worth. As I turned to leave, I carried with me the knowledge that no obstacle, betrayal, or act of cruelty could ever strip me of the autonomy and dignity I had reclaimed. The symbolic closure was complete. I had faced the cold, endured the fall, navigated the aftermath, and emerged whole, empowered, and resolute, ready to continue my life with clarity, confidence, and the profound satisfaction of having turned a night of fear into a lifelong testament to survival and personal strength. As I stood outside the barracks one final time, watching the faint winter sun reflect off the snow, I wanted to share not just my story, but the lessons I had learned from every shiver, every agonizing moment, and every decision that had led me from fear to empowerment. To anyone listening, watching, or reading, understand this: you are not alone. The betrayal, the shock, and the deep sense of injustice you may have faced are valid. Every experience of being dismissed, overlooked, or harmed by those who should have protected you is real, and it matters. If you have ever endured a family member's cruelty, a manipulative figure's control, or a situation where those around you turned away in indifference, take a moment to honor your survival. You have already shown immense strength by enduring, by breathing through the pain, and by refusing to let fear dominate your life. I want to encourage everyone to speak up. Share your story in the comments below. There is power in words, in testimony, in letting others hear that you have lived through something unjust and survived. It does not matter if your trauma comes from a family member, a partner, a mentor, or someone in a position of authority. What matters is that your experience is acknowledged. By sharing, you validate your journey and inspire others to find the courage to speak. In my own journey, I realized that silence only amplifies the power of those who harm, while a voice clear and unwavering can ignite change. Comment your story, no matter how small or large it may feel. Your story can resonate, empower, and connect with others who may feel isolated. It is an invitation to build a community of support, understanding, and collective resilience. Consider this: also, survival is not just about physical endurance. It is about mental clarity, emotional awareness, and recognizing your worth. For me, being pushed from that second-floor window was a literal and metaphorical awakening. The cold, the snow, and the hours I spent fighting to stay conscious mirrored the fight we all have against doubt, fear, and internalized oppression. Each of us carries moments where we feel powerless. We may be overlooked, underestimated, or abandoned, but those moments are also where courage is forged. By reflecting on my experience, I hope to remind others that they have untapped reserves of strength. Hypothermia taught me the importance of persistence. Survival instincts reminded me to act decisively, and the indifference of my stepdad and stepbrother illuminated how vital it is to recognize when to protect oneself. In real life, these lessons are universal. There will always be challenges. There will always be people who underestimate or even betray you, but your awareness, preparation, and refusal to succumb are the keys to empowerment. Revenge and justice are not simply acts of retaliation. They are about reclaiming agency, setting boundaries, and demonstrating to the world and yourself that harm cannot go unchecked. After my ordeal, pursuing accountability through the base investigation and eventual legal proceedings was both necessary and cathartic. The public exposure of my stepdad's actions, the testimony of witnesses, and the confirmation of evidence did more than punish wrongdoers. It affirmed my right to safety, dignity, and respect. For anyone who has faced similar injustice, consider that the path to justice may be challenging and uncomfortable, but it validates your experience and reinforces the principle that no one has the right to undermine your life or threaten your well-being. Sharing your story, seeking accountability, and advocating for yourself are not acts of spite. They are assertions of your value and autonomy. To those of you who may still be navigating recovery physically, emotionally, or psychologically, I encourage you to recognize the journey as ongoing. Healing is not linear. It is a process of reflection, learning, and growth. Therapy, supportive relationships, and safe environments are not luxuries. They are essential tools for reclaiming your life. PTSD, anxiety, or the lingering effects of betrayal are natural responses to unnatural circumstances, and acknowledging them is part of empowerment. Allow yourself grace and patience. Celebrate small victories, leaving a toxic environment, speaking your truth, asserting your boundaries, or simply surviving another day. Each step forward is proof of resilience. Furthermore, remember that empowerment is contagious. By speaking out and demonstrating strength, you inspire others to recognize their own value. By refusing to stay silent in the face of injustice, you set a precedent that abuse and betrayal cannot define a life. When I reflected on the barracks window, I realized it was no longer a symbol of vulnerability, but of triumph and agency. I could transform fear into clarity, shock into determination, and suffering into purpose. Your experiences, too, can become catalysts for change. Whether through personal boundaries, public testimony, or sharing your journey with others, the impact of asserting your worth can ripple far beyond your immediate situation. Now I ask you, if you are watching this story unfold or reading these words, take a moment to reflect on your own life. Who or what has undermined your safety or dignity? Where have you felt powerless, ignored, or betrayed? Acknowledge it. Then consider the steps you can take to reclaim control. Assert your value and protect yourself from further harm. Engage in conversations, write down your experiences, seek allies, and connect with those who understand. Comment below to create a dialogue to validate experiences and to build a network of shared understanding. Every voice strengthens the collective awareness of injustice and empowers others to take action in their own lives. If you found this story compelling, please like and subscribe for more accounts of resilience, survival, and justice. Each story is meant to inspire, to awaken courage, and to highlight the profound capacity of individuals to overcome betrayal, abuse, and adversity. By subscribing, you join a community committed to witnessing truth, acknowledging pain, and celebrating the triumph of justice over cruelty. It is a space where survival is honored and voices are amplified. Finally, remember these words: you are not broken. You are not invisible. Your voice matters. No matter the obstacles, the betrayal, or the moments of fear, your resilience is real and powerful. Each act of survival, every courageous choice, and every refusal to accept harm is a testament to your value. You deserve safety, respect, and the fulfillment of your potential. Speak your truth, share your journey, and embrace the empowerment that comes from reclaiming agency. Your story, like mine, can be a beacon of strength for others who need to see that overcoming is possible, that justice can be served, and that life after betrayal can still be meaningful and triumphant. Comment your story below, engage with the community, and let others know they are not alone. Like, subscribe, and stay connected for stories that resonate, inspire, and remind us all of the power of human resilience. Let this be a call to action, not only to witness survival and justice, but to participate in it, to validate experiences, and to encourage change in the face of adversity. Every comment, every share, every act of acknowledgement contributes to a larger tapestry of empowerment, community, and accountability. You have the right to be seen, to be heard, and to assert your worth. Never forget that. Your story is important, your survival is extraordinary, and your voice matters to the world.